Spiderhead is a really fancy prison, like a fancy hotel. It's a science place where they try to improve the world. In this prison, inmates have a more relaxed life. They can go for walks, talk to each other, and even earn rewards to shorten their sentences. But there's a catch. Spiderhead does medical tests, and some of them can be dangerous. However, inmates can choose whether or not to participate, and they can always go back to a regular cell if they want to. In a different prison, there's a guy named Ray who sits in front of a mirror. Another guy named Steve starts an experiment by putting some stuff in Ray's blood. Then, they give Ray some medicine and tell him jokes. Ray laughs a lot at the jokes. Even when they switch to telling him sad stuff, Ray keeps laughing. Every morning, it's the same routine. Loudspeaker wakes up the guys and they're told they're needed for experiments. Steve asks Jeff if he wants to test a brand new substance called N40 compound, which nobody has tried yet. Jeff agrees to be part of the experiment. Along with the test drug, they also give him another substance to boost the parts of his brain related to speech. This helps Jeff talk about his experience in a lot of detail, even the tiny things. When Jeff goes back to the Spiderhead compound, he meets Lizzie and shares about his walk earlier. Sadly, he can't remember everything he saw because the drug he took to improve his vocabulary limits his ability to speak. All Jeff can recall is feeling deep love and admiration for everything around him during the experiment, like flowers or factory pipes. Later, while sitting in bed that evening, Jeff remembers how he ended up in prison. He and his friend decided to have fun at the party by going for a drive. Jeff, who was drunk, ended up driving. The next day, during the N40 trials, now called Cupid, Jeff is joined by Heather, who quickly changes her mind about her partner after taking drugs. Their conversation lasts only briefly before they give in to their desires and become intimate, disregarding the fact that they are being watched and recorded. The drug completely removes their inhibitions, leading them to confess their love for each other. Steve, pleased with the outcome, instructs his partner Mark to closely monitor the subjects to observe their behavior once the effects of the drug wear off. The couple feels uncomfortable after a strange incident. Jeff avoids talking about it and spends time with Lizzie instead of Heather. The next day, they give Jeff the same substance, but with a stronger dose. This time, an older woman is present, and Jeff feels disgusted at first, but he falls in love with her after the substance takes effect. Afterward, Jeff asks to be separated from Lizzie while they work because he feels uncomfortable being around her. Steve brings Jeff into the lab, but this time Jeff stands on the opposite side of the glass. Steve points out that Jeff's previous partners are inside the experiment room. The supervisor asks Jeff to choose which girl he wants to give a substance that causes fear and pain, but Jeff can't decide. He cares for both girls and doesn't want to harm either. Eventually, they let the girls go and end the experiment. Jeff then calls his girlfriend who was with him during the accident on that fateful night. Once more, Jeff only hears Lizzie's voicemail when he tries to call her in the evening. Later, he and Lizzie plan a little Christmas surprise together. However, when Jeff finds himself back in the lab, he sees Rogan, a big prisoner with lots of tattoos. Remembering recent events with the girls, Jeff decides he doesn't want to take part in the experiment. After a few minutes of quiet, nothing happens, and they're just let go. Jeff understands what just happened. He and Rogan worked together with a female prisoner. She had to decide who would get medication. When Jeff saw her with Steve, he knew something was up. The doctor didn't argue with her. Instead, he showed a diagram of how the drug affects people. When Jeff complained, Steve reminded him that being in Spiderhead was a privilege. If Jeff wasn't happy, he could go to a regular prison, but without the chance of early release. The next time Jeff calmly sits with Rogan in the same room, Steve sends Mark on a weekend trip, telling him to enjoy his time on the mainland. Steve himself decides to take the Cupid drug to experience the intense pleasure he had observed in his subjects during experiments. As the experiments proceed, Steve warns Jeff that they'll need to give the drug to the girls as demanded by a certain committee to maintain the purity of the experiment. Jeff expresses his reluctance, not wanting anyone to suffer the effects of the substance, regardless of his feelings for the girls. However, Steve insists, reminding Jeff of the privileges he enjoys by cooperating and avoiding a return to a regular prison. Jeff agrees to give Heather the dark influx. Heather becomes upset and starts to cry, but the management stays calm and records the information while listening to Jeff, who doesn't show any romantic feelings. The experiment's goal is achieved, and Steve plans to end it. However, there's an error, and Heather loses control. She grabs a sharp object and frees herself from the effects of the dark influx. While Steve and Mark are occupied with Heather, Jeff notices the supervisor's lost keys. He also finds a notebook containing records of future experiments and a lottery ticket with the same numbers as the medication names. This makes Jeff realize that Steve is no longer observing from behind the glass. Jeff successfully locks the safe and discreetly hides the keys to keep the doctor from discovering his secret. Steve cautions Mark that if anyone uncovers the truth about Heather's situation, they'll all be held accountable. Meanwhile, Lizzie takes part in the experiments for the first time, where they administer a substance to darken her thoughts. Afterward, she confides in Jeff about her uncertainties regarding the experiment's effectiveness compared to a strict prison. Jeff reciprocates by revealing that his girlfriend was also in the car during the accident that took her life, driving him to undergo the trials as a form of penance. Their heartfelt conversation leads to them spending the night together. Steve notices the bond forming between the subjects and plans to exploit it for his own agenda. When Jeff shows up for the next experiment, he finds out he has to decide whether to give Lizzie a powerful drug called Darken Phlox or leave the experiment. Jeff refuses, but the doctor allows him to delay the decision until the next morning. When he sees Lizzie's personal file, he discovers the crime she committed is so horrifying to her that no amount of Darken Phlox could make it worse. Steve the doctor enjoys seeing Jeff increase the dosage of the drug, but Jeff's real intention becomes clear. He plans to use Steve as the subject of the experiment, not Lizzie. Mark realizes he's been tricked by Steve along with the prisoners. Wanting to make things right, he gives the remote control to Jeff. With guidance from Steve, Jeff convinces him to open the main exit so they can escape, but the manager takes control and gives Lizzie a harmful dose of medicine, causing her a lot of pain. He destroys his phone so his command can't be stopped. Jeff and Lizzie fight off the effects of the medicine and escape the lab. Meanwhile, Steve announces over the speakers that everyone else will be sent back to their prisons. Jeff and Lizzie become the targets of a hunt by other inmates, led by Rogan. Steve tries to flee with the medicine, but ends up injected with a large dose himself. He manages to escape in a plane just before the police arrive, but without his remote control, the medicine overwhelms him. In the new Cupid movie, a guy falls in love and decides to fly his plane to a small rocky island, thinking it's a perfect spot. Meanwhile, the police boss watches from a boat as his old employee's plane crashes into the rocks. Jeff and Lizzie, the main characters, take control of a boat and escape before the police show up. They feel relieved and happy, but wish their friend Steve had invented something to help them forgive themselves. And that's how the movie wraps up.
Here you will get mind-blowing movie recaps every time. Show your support to the channel. Thanks.